I want to take just a second to thank some people. Bishop Paul Bays is not able to be with us this evening, but he has sponsored my trip to the UK, and I've been to a couple of different places and done several events here in Liverpool, which has been just such a joy. Bishop Paul models really beautifully what it is for a straight ally to use his privilege on behalf of marginalized people, and particularly folks who identify as LGBTQIA. I am also grateful to Edman, who is not here yet, but I think is coming, who has been my companion, and often my hilarious companion the past few days. Where's Miranda? Miranda? Thank you for inviting me here to St. Bride's, and Warren and Kieran and all of you. I'm just delighted to be here. I also want to thank one other person who is here this evening, and that's Jen Williams, who has been my host at Tzedakah House, my gracious and lovely host at Tzedakah, and we've had some marvelous, really marvelous conversations. Jen is a shining example of what the church risks losing as we waffle in ambivalence about who can be ordained and under what terms. And so I want to dedicate this lecture tonight to Jen and to many, many others who are struggling to including, I don't doubt, many people in this room tonight who are struggling to discern how to bring our gifts to bear in a world that desperately needs it. And if this lecture maybe can offer any assistance in thinking about that, I'll be immensely gratified. Why are you here? This is a real question. And if you're not sure what the answer is, I want to encourage you to think about that a little bit. Why are you here tonight? I come to events like this because in my faith life, I'm always searching for something true, something alive. How does the sacred come alive for us, both in our individual lives and in the relationships that we forge with others? When do you feel it? What does it feel like? Does it energize you, challenge you, frighten you, excite you? I hope whatever it feels like, that it makes your life more possible. That's what a living faith does for me, all of this. It happens for me particularly when I have the opportunity to dive into Scripture and see what is lurking there. There are few activities that I love so much as sitting in a seminary library diving deep into a text. This work, you may know, is called exegesis. A few months ago, I was struggling with a bout of situational depression, and I had to go to the library and work on a sermon. And something happened to me that almost always happens to me in this setting. I saw something in the text that I had never seen before. It took me completely by surprise, and I felt like I was on fire. I could feel myself stretching spiritually, reaching, growing, and my depression vanished. I texted a friend, "Next time I'm depressed, just say to me, 'Liz, go exegete something. You'll feel better.'" My primary exegetical lens is a queer one. In Scripture, I perceive the relentless disruption of false binaries and the disruption of antagonistic energy. I hear God again and again calling us to upend coercive power structures that do harm to people's bodies and souls. Queerness is an excellent lens for someone who wants faith to come alive. Why? Well, first, because queerness is curious It forces you to look closely at what's really going on, ask interesting questions, and demand honest answers, which means queerness makes you stretch. It calls you to learn and to grow. Second, queerness is scandalous. Precisely because it is disruptive, queerness shakes up people's rigid ideas about right and wrong. At its best, queerness is far less interested in making moral pronouncements and far more interested in digging into a situation to see what's really going on. A queer lens is not afraid to look scandal in the eye in its relentless search for that which is true. Our topic tonight is Scandal of a Queer God. I want to talk about the ways that Jesus' incarnation, his state of being both human and divine, is both queer and scandalous. I want to talk about how I think the church struggles with this queer aspect of Jesus' being, and using this just as an example, I want to explore how engaging the queerness of the Christian tradition draws out what is truly interesting about Christianity and propels us toward a mature faith, one that stretches and grows and is exciting and alive. Okay, so I just said that Jesus' incarnation is both queer and scandalous. Let's take a moment to think about what this means. First, how is Jesus' essential makeup queer? To me, this is pretty obvious. By coming to earth as both human and divine, Jesus queers whatever binary one might think exists between humanity and God. The central thesis of my book, Queer Virtue, is that authentic Christianity is and must be queer. When people ask me what this means, the first example I always cite is the Christian assertion that Jesus is both human and divine. And I tell you, even folks who aren't at all versed in queerness immediately grasp what I'm talking about. The incarnation thus already meets one criterion of queerness. It is curious as hell. Early Christians were consumed with the question of who Jesus was and how he was composed. The question was resolved in the Council of Chalcedon in CE 451 with the declaration that Jesus was fully God and fully human. The intention was to establish a single standard for orthodoxy and, I suspect, give folks something solid to hold on to. But this is hardly glib reductionist theology. I rather love this doctrine precisely because it is such a steep challenge to try to grasp the basic narrative of God coming to earth as a person and being fully both. If you take even a moment with this idea, you'll see what I mean. It is rocket science and brain surgery and Einstein's theory of relativity all wrapped up in one mind-bending package, and if you think about it for too long, your head really will explode. Consider yourself warned. At some point, you have to chalk the whole thing up to mystery and let yourself stand in awe as you gaze upon something so breathtaking that it is almost incomprehensible. You have to do this, because if you don't, it is way too easy and way too tempting to start spinning around in little dualistic circles, inventing theologies about how Jesus simply could not be human and fully divine, or could not have been killed bodily. And this is why Jesus' essential makeup is not just queer, but also scandalous. Just listen to this basic premise of Christianity. The power of God infuses a human form and is summarily executed. Put aside for a moment whatever conventional pictures exist in your head about what this all looks like. Some white dude, Mel Gibson or Joaquin Phoenix, in a loincloth, nailed to a cross on a super gloomy day. Little drops of blood speckling his forehead with the thorns that pricked his skin. We all know that image. It's so familiar that it's hard to look under it to see what we actually claim is going on. Instead, take a moment to consider what it means to say that the supreme power of the universe in human form can be killed. This is the definition of scandal. This is not the way things are supposed to be. This is not how God is supposed to operate. Bad as this is, the scandal of the incarnation cuts even deeper because it flies in the face of long-standing conventional notions that there is something abject in the human condition. Why would God want to assume human form? Why would God want to deal with a body that defecates and throws up and makes embarrassing noises and has to deal with sexual arousal at the most awkward moments? Humans have long assigned these experiences to the realm of the profane. Jesus' incarnation, God's ability to inhabit one of these bodies, directly refutes the idea that there is something inherently profane about our bodily experiences. Thus, the incarnation disrupts not just a perceived binary between human experience and divine, but also between conventional ideas about what is sacred and what is profane. And Christianity doesn't stop at simple disruption. Early Christian community adopted as its modus operandi the ancient concept that most succinctly captured the essence of profanity. It is expressed in the Greek word koinos. Koinos means common or shared. It stands directly opposite the definition of sacred, which means set apart. Early on in the Gospels, the word koinos is used as shorthand for things that are ritualistically unclean. It is often translated as defiled. Jesus himself uses the word koinos to describe behaviors that are offensive to God. But something happens to koinos on the road to Damascus. It undergoes a conversion experience. It gets queered. Early Christians leaned hard into the definition of koinos as that which is shared and set it at the center of their common communal life. Koinos is an adjective derived from the female noun koinonia. And you may know this word. Koinonia is the root of our word communion or fellowship. And that brings us right to the heart of this lecture tonight. It is clear to me that the scandal of Christianity generally poses a steep challenge to the church. One of the scandals that we might spend a bit more time with is the radical implication of declaring Jesus to be fully God and fully human. The doctrine of the atonement relies on the idea that when Jesus ascends to heaven, he ascends bodily. Jesus completes our reconciliation to God by bringing his humanity, a bit of us, back to heaven. This is another mind-bending idea, and we won't spend time on it so as not to place ourselves at further risk of mid-lecture cerebral explosions. But the point is, he doesn't return to heaven and leave his humanity behind. Now, it's understandably tempting to ease our grip on that human side so that we can worship Jesus as fully divine. But this is lazy theology, and I worry about it for so many reasons, not least because easing up on the essential challenge of Jesus' human life starves our tradition of perhaps its greatest source of life. Life that challenges, life that is curious, life that has the possibility of maturing. The problem is that if you let go of the human Jesus, you end up with a Jesus who is perfect. Perfect Jesus eases all the intestinal discomfort created by a God who treads the line between human and divine. Perfect Jesus resolves the scandal of a God who takes on human form. But is that our goal, to resolve the scandal of our faith? Should God's queerness be resolved? And if so, at what cost? The impact of denying Jesus' human side is profound. For one thing, perfect Jesus is an impossible model for us to relate to, let alone emulate. Sure, you might find Jesus, you might feel him right there at your side when you're struggling, because Jesus knew what it was to suffer. But how about when you have just really screwed up? Can you imagine Jesus patting you sympathetically on the back, right there with you? I know exactly how you feel. Human Jesus is someone who learned, who grew. He is someone who can help us mature in our faith as he did. And this points us to a much bigger problem. Failing to recognize Jesus' full humanity means we stop maturing in our faith, and this breeds toxicity in our religion. You know, it's common for Christians to say that Jesus was not the warrior Messiah that first century Jews expected. Truth is, Jesus is a Messiah that many Christians today would reject. Perfect Jesus becomes easily weaponized. Worshiping perfect Jesus contributes to Christian chauvinism, in which Christianity is viewed as the only authentic route to salvation. It is not a stretch at all to see how this kind of thinking breeds virulent anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, rabid white nationalism, and the persecution of queer people, immigrants, and anyone deemed other. And truth is, we needn't spin ourselves into theological circles debating this. Scripture itself was clear that Jesus was not perfect. At various moments, we see Jesus being grumpy, short-tempered, and even peevish with his disciples. I want to explore with you a text that gets at all of this. The story of Jesus' encounter with the Syro-Phoenician woman. This is the woman who comes to Jesus to ask him to cast a demon out of her daughter. And Jesus responds by calling her a dog. To me, this is perhaps the clearest gospel story where Jesus demonstrates his full humanity. First, pardon my language, because he is an asshole to this woman. And second, because in this story, he changes his mind. We see his eyes being opened, and we see his actions change to meet his newfound understanding. The oldest, cleanest version of this story is told in Mark, chapter 7, verses 24 to 30. This story appears slap in the middle of the Gospel of Mark, and it is pivotal, is literally a pivot, both for Jesus and for the movement he is leading. To understand it, we have to start at the beginning of that chapter, where the Pharisees are challenging Jesus about his disciples' practice of eating without washing their hands. This is how the 7th chapter of Mark begins. Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they don't eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there were also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. Okay, what is Mark talking about? This text may seem sensible to us because we are so accustomed to washing before we eat. But this is not the Pharisees saying, "Excuse me, did you rinse the pesticide off that apple before you bit into it?" Nor are they saying, "Oh, gross, you've just come directly from Lime Street. Can you please wash your hands before you grab the bread that we're all sharing?" This is not about hygiene. This is about the Jewish tradition of taking everyday activities like eating and washing and turning them into opportunities to show one's devotion to God. The idea here is that one takes regular human activity and marks it, sets it apart from whatever basic animal need is being met, in order to be reminded constantly of the covenant that Israel has forged with God. That setting apart is precisely the definition of what it is to make something holy. When the disciples fail to wash their hands, they are disrespecting this tradition. They are transgressing the boundary between sacred and profane, which is why the Pharisees describe their hands not as dirty, but as defiled. The Greek word they use is koinos. Jesus goes head to head with the Pharisees on this, and honestly, it's not entirely clear why. This practice of using everyday activities to show devotion to God is, in fact, a truly beautiful aspect of Judaism. And there's no question that the disciples were violating some kind of standard for religious leaders. My suspicion is that there's something going on that we can't see in the text. Perhaps Jesus is protesting ways that this contrast between sacred and profane is being used to elevate the priesthood at the expense of poor people. Christians have the very unfortunate tendency to view Jesus as a singular figure who all by himself confronted problematic temple practices, revealed the hypocrisy of the scribes and Pharisees, and voila, launched a whole new faith tradition. What we fail to see is that very often Jesus is simply giving voice to tensions within first century Judaism that many, many people were involved in. This is one of the dangers of failing to appreciate Jesus' full humanity, and it can make it much harder to perceive what is actually going on in the stories we hear about him. In this story, Jesus is trying to say something radically important about koinos. He knows that there's something problematic about associating that which is common, that which is shared, with the profane. He struggles to name it. Bypassing the Pharisees, he addresses the crowd that has gathered. Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. The disciples are super confused by this, and when they get to a private place with Jesus, they continue to question him about it. His response to them gets a little clearer. Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart, but the stomach, and goes out into the sewer? Pushing the point as far as it will go, he declares, it is what comes out of a person that defiles. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. He offers a long list of bad, mean, cruel things that people do, and closes the argument by saying, all these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. Interestingly, Jesus has argued himself into a theological corner. He wants to change the terms for what is considered clean and unclean, but by clinging to the concept of defilement, he has not yet perceived that continuing to demonize koinos creates its own problem. Jesus is trying to say something important, but he can't do it by himself. In order to queer koinos, Both theologically and communally, Jesus needs a moment of koinonia, of fellowship. He needs a conversational partner whose real life experience will bring him down from the world of abstraction and into the world of human reality. And into his path steps the Syro-Phoenician woman. Their entire encounter is an enactment of the very dynamics that he has just described, and at every level it challenges Jesus to clarify what he is arguing. The story begins by emphasizing the degree to which Jesus is stuck. It says, "From there he set out and went away to the region of Tyre, and entering a house, he did not want anyone to know he was there, and he could not escape notice." This is a double use of the Greek word kai, and. He wants to be alone, and he cannot. The impossibility of his situation is punctured by the Syro-Phoenician woman, who enters with the conjunction Allah, which means but, nevertheless. With a single word, Mark indicates that she is here to address the tension of his predicament. It says, "But a woman whose small daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him, and she came and bowed at his feet." Note first that this woman has just gone into Jesus, which we know he just as soon she not do, to tell him about an unclean spirit that has gone into her daughter. Already, the lived experience of these two people, the woman and her daughter, is complicating Jesus' assertion that what goes into the body cannot defile. The story continues. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." In the entire gospel, is there an uglier sentence attributed to Jesus? This would be a good moment to note that the problem of the perfect Jesus is not exclusive to right-wing white nationalist Christians. Liturgies in the Book of Common Prayer, both British and American, draw from the letter of the Hebrews to describe Jesus as being tempted in every way we are, yet without sin. But I'm sorry, calling someone a dog is a sin in my book. Jesus misses the mark here, but good, and there is no neat and easy way to say he doesn't. His sharp, insulting rebuke substantiates his earlier point that what comes out of a person is what defiles. So maybe he's trying to prove his point. Yet still, he's contradicting himself. Jesus has just worked overtime to distinguish actual bread from bread as spiritual metaphor, specifically to shake up people's glib notions about what is sacred and what is profane. But here he is, drawing on the metaphor of bread to cast this woman and her daughter into the land of permanent dis-ease. Bread that he just said was not inherently clean or unclean has now become so precious and sacred that it is limited to only a few, and he's the one who decides who will get it. Something has got to give here. But what is the course correction that is needed? Can Jesus lean a bit harder into his divine side to come up with a better response to this woman? Yes, but in order to do so, he has to dive more deeply into his humanity. He needs to learn something. He has to change. The woman gives him exactly what he needs. Using a drumbeat of affirmative conjunctions, she pushes him into a place where the contradictions can be resolved. And she answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord, and the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." This is an extraordinary move on her part. By owning the abject state he assigns to her, she owns the scandal that she is to him, reflecting back to him the scandal that he is to himself. She forces him to acknowledge that no, her daughter is not a dog. She is a human being, and so is he. You may be familiar with Matthew's version of this story. Embellishing on Mark, Matthew emphasizes Jesus' amazement. "Woman, great is your faith!" But Mark doesn't offer us such distracting melodrama. In Mark's account, Jesus simply says, "Because of this word, because of what you have just said, go. The demon has left your daughter." Jesus' words may be simple, but what has just transpired is not. Using his own definition of defilement against him, the coarse, common, vulgar words that have just come out of his mouth, this Greek woman forces Jesus to prove that he is not perfect, not set apart, in the way he himself criticizes in religious leadership. She meets him on the turf that he has created, stands face to face with him, and pulls him onto higher ground, common ground. In doing so, she upends his theology and pushes it deeper, making a theological case for koinos as a spiritual strength, as an essential component of the sacred. She has just queered his teaching, queered him, and something more. She has paved the road for defilement, koinos, to become the ground on which a new faith movement will be built. I said earlier that this story is a pivotal moment in the gospel. The word koinos will not appear again in Mark's gospel. In Acts and in the epistles, we hear instead constant reference to koinonia, sharing, fellowship, as the basis for Christian community. And it starts with this woman and Jesus. Together they have just shared liturgical bread at a sacred table, foreshadowing the meal, both physical and spiritual, that Jesus will have with his disciples and that Christians continue to share to this day. Okay. So where does this get us? The story of the Syro-Phoenician woman confronts the problem of the perfect Jesus in multiple ways. It undermines singular Jesus by showing his need of this woman and by highlighting his imperfection. If we can be so bold as to draw a parallel between this very human Jesus and his very human body, the church, this story highlights the importance of human experience to valid church teaching. Mark offers us a beautiful model of someone learning, growing in their faith, getting it wrong, and then getting it right. And how much more powerful that the person doing the learning and growing is Jesus himself, and the teacher in this story is the person he has just marginalized. This is a real Jesus who undercuts Christian chauvinism, Christian exceptionalism, and Christian nationalism, and bolsters attempts to see God at work in human experience, all human experience. This is a Jesus who engages with us, is affected by us. This is a Jesus who simultaneously understands our failings and calls us to higher ground. Now, if it sounds like I've just given you an argument that neatly resolves tensions within 21st century Christianity, think again. Nothing about this conversation is neat and tidy. All this does is raise deeper, harder questions for us to grapple with, and that's the point. For those of us who try to follow Jesus, The queerness of Christianity demands that we grow, that we never stop learning. This is precisely the scandal of the very queer God who enlivens our faith, because this is a God who incessantly forces us to ask new questions, to stretch our minds and our hearts, to grow in ways that are sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes lovely, and always, always irrepressibly alive. Thank you.